History is rarely a simple tapestry of black and white, though we often try to dye it that way for the sake of a convenient story. In the long gallery of English monarchs, few figures have been painted with such dark, monochromatic strokes as Mary I. To the casual student of history, she is Bloody Mary, a name that evokes the smell of wood smoke and the chilling sight of the stake. We imagine a bitter, aging woman, blinded by religious fervor, seeking to drag a protesting nation back into the arms of Rome. But to see only the fire is to miss the woman who walked through it. To understand Mary Tudor, we must look past the propaganda of her successors and the tragedy of her final years. We must see the golden princess who was discarded, the daughter who was broken, and the queen who, against every possible odd, became the first woman to wear the crown of England in her own right. Her story begins not with ash, but with the brightest of hopes. On a cold February morning in 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Catherine of Aragon gave birth to a daughter. King Henry VIII, though he craved a son above all else, was initially delighted. He was a man in his prime, and Catherine was his beloved queen. He celebrated the birth of Mary with the typical Tudor extravagance, famously telling a Venetian ambassador that "this girl does not cry." He saw in her the future of his dynasty, even if that future was meant to be as a bride to a foreign prince. Mary's early childhood was a Renaissance dream. She was a precocious, intelligent child with her mother's copper gold hair and her father's piercing eyes. She was educated by the finest scholars, mastering Latin, French, and Spanish, while becoming an accomplished musician on the virginals and the lute. By the age of 9, she was sent to the Welsh marches to hold her own court, treated in almost every way as the heir to the throne. She was the pearl of the world, the center of a courtly universe that seemed stable, divine, and eternal. She was the pride of her father and the heartbeat of her mother's life. But the foundations of that world were built on the shifting sands of Henry VIII's conscience, or perhaps more accurately, his desperation. By the mid-1520s, the king's obsession with a male heir had become a political and religious crisis. Catherine of Aragon had suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Only Mary remained. Henry became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God because she had been the wife of his late brother, Arthur. As the great matter of the king's divorce began to unfold, Mary's life was systematically dismantled. She was no longer the golden princess. She was an obstacle. When Henry eventually broke with the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary's world collapsed. She was stripped of her title, declared a bastard, and separated from her mother. The psychological cruelty of this period is difficult to overstate. Mary was forbidden from seeing Catherine even when her mother was dying of cancer. She was forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, and was subjected to the constant taunts and threats of the new queen's supporters. She was told she was nothing. Her mother was a concubine, and her faith was a delusion. Through these years of bastardy and isolation, Mary's Catholic faith became her fortress. It was not merely a set of rituals, but her only remaining connection to her mother and her identity as a legitimate princess. She refused to acknowledge the king as the supreme head of the church, a stance that brought her dangerously close to the executioner's block. In 1536, following the execution of Anne Boleyn, Mary was finally pushed to her limit. Under immense pressure and the threat of death, she signed a document acknowledging her own illegitimacy and her father's religious supremacy. It was a moment of profound self-betrayal that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was allowed back to court, but she was a shadow of the girl she had once been. She spent the remainder of her father's reign playing the role of the dutiful daughter, befriending Henry's later wives, particularly Catherine Parr, and acting as a godmother to her young brother Edward. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed to 9-year-old Edward VI. Under the guidance of radical Protestant advisers, the English Reformation accelerated at a pace that horrified Mary. The Latin Mass was banned, and the colorful rituals of the medieval church were replaced by the austere beauty of the Book of Common Prayer. For Mary, this was a battle for the soul of the nation. She continued to have the Mass celebrated in her private chapel, defying the king and his council. The tension between the brother and sister grew until Edward's untimely death in 1553. In a final attempt to keep England Protestant, Edward and his advisors attempted to bypass Mary and Elizabeth in the succession, naming the teenage Lady Jane Grey as queen. Mary fled to East Anglia and raised an army of supporters, appealing to the people's sense of legitimacy and their lingering love for her mother. To the surprise of the Protestant elite, the country rose in her favor. The 9 Days Queen was deposed, and Mary Tudor entered London in a triumph that seemed like a miracle. At 37 years old, Mary was finally queen. Her first year was marked by a sense of restoration and justice. She freed Catholic prisoners from the Tower, restored the Mass, and initially showed a surprising degree of clemency toward those who had tried to usurp her. But Mary was a woman in a hurry. She believed she had been preserved by God for one purpose: to return England to the Roman Catholic fold. To secure this future, she needed a husband and an heir. She ignored the warnings of her council and chose Philip of Spain, the son of her cousin, Emperor Charles V. It was a disastrous political move. To the English people, the marriage signaled that England would become a mere satellite of the Spanish Empire. In 1554, Wyatt's rebellion brought rebels to the very gates of London. Mary, showing the legendary lion's heart of the Tudors, gave a stirring speech at the Guildhall. She told the people that if a mother may love her child, she might love them, and they responded with a roar of approval. The rebellion was crushed, but it hardened her heart. She realized that to save the soul of her kingdom, she would have to be ruthless. Lady Jane Grey was executed, and Mary's sister Elizabeth was sent to the Tower, narrowly escaping the same fate. The marriage to Philip went ahead in Winchester, but it was a tragedy of the heart. Mary was deeply in love with her younger, distant husband, but Philip saw the marriage as a political chore. Philip spent as little time in England as possible, leaving Mary to deal with a blossoming economic crisis and a series of bad harvests. This desperation, combined with her absolute conviction that heresy was a spiritual plague, led to the start of the Marian Persecutions in 1555. Over the next 3 years, nearly 300 men and women were burned at the stake for their religious beliefs. While heresy trials were common in the 16th century, the sheer number of executions in such a short time was unprecedented in England. Mary believed she was cauterizing a wound to save the body. Instead, she was creating a legacy of martyrdom that would define the English identity for centuries. The deaths of bishops like Latimer and Ridley and the agonizing execution of Thomas Cranmer were documented and distributed. These stories turned public opinion against the Queen and her church. The sight of ordinary weavers and laborers dying in the flames for their faith made the old religion look like a foreign tyranny. It was during these years that the name Bloody Mary began to take root in the shadows of the streets. The final years of Mary's reign were a litany of sorrow. She suffered through 2 phantom pregnancies, where her body mimicked the signs of a child she desperately wanted but would never have. These were likely the result of the same illnesses, perhaps ovarian or uterine cancer, that were slowly killing her. In 1558, she suffered the ultimate political blow: the loss of Calais, England's last foothold in France, during a war she had entered to support Philip. She famously said that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. Isolated, unloved by her subjects, and abandoned by her husband, Mary died on November 17, 1558. Her death was greeted with Merry England celebrations and the ringing of bells as the country looked toward Elizabeth. Yet, to remember Mary only as a failure is to ignore the blueprint she left behind. She was the first woman to successfully navigate the treacherous waters of the English monarchy without a king at her side. She proved that the crown did not require a male head to function. She reformed the navy, reorganized the counting house, and proved that a Queen Regnant could command an army and a parliament. She was a woman of immense courage and terrible limitations, a victim of her own convictions in an age that was rapidly changing. Today, she lies in Westminster Abbey, sharing a tomb with the sister who dismantled everything she worked for. In the end, the Bloody Mary of myth and the tragic queen of history are the same person, a woman who tried to hold back the tide of the future with nothing but her faith and her crown. She was a survivor of a brutal family dynasty who tried to find certainty in an uncertain world. In death, the two sisters, one who burned for the old world and one who built the new, are finally at peace, joined together in the hope of one resurrection.